this is actually now deprecated. You would never use this if you have a mix of protocols. So if you had SIP phones and skinny phones, well, you could initiate a firmware upload without knowing it. And so this is just one time I want to just talk about telephony service setup. We won't talk about it again, because one of the commands that's put in here is auto assign. It will just basically auto register all phones, and telephony service setup is actually using the skinny protocol. So if we had a SIP phone and it already had SIP firmware and we had the telephony service setup command run, then potentially we could upgrade that SIP phone to skinny firmware, and it could cost us a lot of time. So we never want to use this again, but this is the one time in volume 1 we are going to use it. Another time you could use telephony service, and not the setup tool, just telephony service in general. So what I'm telling you is, if you have a mix of protocols, use telephony service, but don't use the setup tool. Another time you can use telephony service is in SRST mode. In this version, it's now supported to run telephony service instead of call manager fallback. Why would you want to do that? Well, telephony service has a larger feature set compared with call manager fallback, so there might be a need for running telephony service to access a particular service while a phone is in SRST mode. For example, maybe call pickup, maybe there's a hunt group functionality, call park. All these things that are not available in call manager fallback, normal unified SRST, and that requires you to run telephony service. So telephony service, in summary, is going to be number 1, using the skinny protocol. We never want to use setup tool, I don't think. And it's not necessarily always going to be used as a call manager express. It can be used in SRST mode, and obviously we'll address the application of telephony service in these instances later on down the line in our volume 1 labs. Without further ado, telephony service setup. We've already set up DHCP. We don't want to use the tool here because it doesn't allow me to have my excluded address ranges in. So I'm going to say no to DHCP, yes to telephony service. We've been asked to use the loopback address of the branch 2 router here, so put the loopback address as the source address of my CME. In other words, the skinny packets from the router are going to be sourced from 10.10.1.10.3, which is loopback 0's primary IP address. There's no need for me to change port 2000, I'll leave it alone. How many IP phones do I want to configure? Well, in this case it's just going to be a single phone. Let's just put 1. We'll talk about dual line later on in the CME lab. Basically, dual line permits me to have a second call on my extension for call waiting. If I'm in an active call and I have another call coming in, I can basically have call waiting. I can have one caller on hold, and I can be talking to one person. I could use this for conferencing when I press hold, new call, and then conference. Basically, dual line refers to having 2 calls on a particular extension. This is, if I say no, it's going to be a single line. A single line will not let me do any conferencing, hold, new call, any consult transfer, or any conference or call waiting. Okay, if I'm on the phone and you call me, you're going to hear busy with a single line. And this is not really the focus of this lab. The focus of this lab is to really show you the telephony service setup. So it doesn't really. Let's put yes. And language on the phones. Let's put English, but the tones are going to be Spain for Spain. 3001 is the first extension number. Direct in with dial. I'm going to keep this simple. You never say yes here. It's going to configure the direct in with dial or the dial plan pattern command, which, as far as you're concerned, is deprecated. You should never use the dial plan pattern command. I will talk about it in the lab 3 in Call Manager Express, but for this point in time, you're never use it. Forget about this dial plan pattern command. Forget this question is always going to have the answer no. Okay, for the rest of your life. Okay. So, do I want to forward calls to voicemail? We're jumping the gun here. We haven't got voicemail ready, but yes, you do have voicemail. And so, if you do run telephony service setup, in the unlikely event that you do, then it's a good idea to just read ahead, find out what the voicemail pilot is for the CME and say yes and put the pilot number, but we're nowhere near configuring voicemail, so I'll put no. Do I want to change anything? No. And what this is going to do, well, I'll tell you, I'm going to show you what this has done. It's configured my TFTP, set up TFTP server. Okay, so I could have, I basically want, what the CME is saying is, he's going to make sure every one of our phones who's registering to the CME is going to have this version of firmware, or these, at minimum, one of these versions of firmware, okay, which are residing on the CME when we extract the tar file on the CME. So we've set up the TFTP server, and inside, let me just do a show run again. It's set up my telephony service, and inside here I said any 7960 or 7940 will have this firmware, and it's set the TFTP server up so that it can TFTP to the client phone that particular firmware. And this is, we're only talking about skinny phones at this point in time. Okay, so the auto assign, it means we're going to auto assign one ePhone DN. Let me just give myself a refresher. Telephony service auto assign. So ePhone DN1, 2. Yeah, so if we had 24 lines, 24 extensions, it would say auto assign 1 to 24. And the 24 extensions, which in our case would be 3001 to 3024, are going to be auto assigned on a first come first served basis to the phones. So it's a bit like the auto registration range inside Call Manager. Okay, so if we go to just very briefly switch over to Call Manager. And let's just say we had 1000 to 1010. These 11, or let's say 1009, these 10 numbers here are going to be auto assigned on a first come first served basis to any phone that's registering to Call Manager. Well, in effect, we're doing the same thing here on CME. Now, it just so happens we've only got one phone, because I put, well, in the telephony service setup wizard, I only put one extension. Can't find it at this point in time, but that's what it's doing. And this is a dangerous command, because this is where you can have a SIP phone that has the right firmware at the start of your lab start upgrading to skinny, which will be very bad for you. Hence, this is why I'm saying just put in run it manually. Run the telephony service configuration manually. Don't use the setup tool. Let's just take a look at what else we have. We've got the network locale, which is going to provide my tones. We've got the create CNF files, which basically means whenever we make any changes, the configuration file of the phone will be modified, and then when you reset the phone, the new configuration file will be sent back down to the phone. So CME relies on the concept of the ePhone DN and dual line. Remember what that was? Allows us to have conference, new call, consult transfer, call waiting. We've got extension 3001, which is ePhone DN1. We've got ePhone 1, and this is assigned to button 1. So ePhone 1, so 3001 is that one there, button 1 colon 1, and this is button 1. So button 1 has extension 3001. The phone type 7960. So all this configuration is built automatically using the telephony service setup tool. Okay, so if we had, and it's the first phone that came in and registered will be ePhone 1, and that we don't really have any control over which phone it's going to be. show ePhone reg and registered. You see there's channel 1 idle, channel 2 idle, which is the dual line. The codec here is G729, maybe that's going to need to change to G711 later on down the line. And ePhones are always skinny, it says registered in skinny version 11.9. What's more important though is show telephony service dial pair. Okay, and show telephony service voice port. So CME phones and SRST phones as well, although they look like IP phones and they have Cat5 Ethernet cable into the back of them, you should not think of them as Ethernet phones or IP phones anymore. You should think of them as the $10 analog phones you can buy in Walmart or wherever you are, in whatever tacky shop you can think of that sells cheap analog phones. That's how you should think of our CME and our SRST phone. It's just an FXS port. Now admittedly this is a virtual FXS port that you do not see in running configuration. Show run include voice port. The only voice port I'll have, well, there isn't any voice ports, but when you type in show telephony service voice port, you'll see a virtual FXS port. Okay, and this virtual FXS port is always, the first phone is always going to be 5001, and then we have this dial pair, show run include dial dash pair, no dial pair, so you don't see it in running configuration, you'll see it in show telephony service dial pair. And we've got the virtual FXS port here, and we've got a destination pattern 3001. So if the router receives a call intended for the extension 3001, it's going to send it to this virtual FXS port, which is your Walmart phone in disguise as a 7960 or 65 or whatever phone it is. Okay, so every CME phone behaves identically or almost identically to an FXS phone or an analog phone connected to an FXS port. So you can also see that it's configured the station ID number. So if 3001 made a call to another extension or to the PSTN, then the caller ID will be 3001 based on the fact that in the FXS port we've got a station ID number command there. And let's just say I put in the ePhone 1 name BR2 phone, let's use proper name, shall we? Let me advertise my own name, Vic. Oh no, I can't do that. ePhone DN1 Vic Marley. Okay, self-promotion. Economy's tough. Show run include voice port. Show telephony service voice port. And you can see that if I made a call out now to let's say extension 3000 to another CME phone, then they would see this calling name. But the point I'm making is ePhone DNs and ePhones, any configuration that you're manipulating here is going to modify the voice port or the dial pair. So when we come down to call lists in the call routing section, you see call lists will be propagated to the voice port or to the dial pair. And so that's why we call these ePhone DNs and ePhones branded dial pairs.